I'm Dennis Reardon, president of Minunkatuk Audubon Society. Welcome to this evening's program. Minunkatuk wishes to honor the indigenous communities native to the chapter area, including the Pagusset, Wepawag, Quinnipiac, Tataket, Minunkatuk, and Hammonasset people. As we advocate for the conservation of land and its wildlife, we're indebted to the work of native and indigenous communities who cherished the land for thousands of years before European colonization. We have two more programs this month. Next Wednesday, week from tomorrow, Corey Folsom O'Keefe is going to talk to us about Audubon salt marsh restoration work. And then on Tuesday, April 23rd, Joyce Origliano, who's works at the Teddy Roosevelt Sanctuary and Center on Long Island, will talk to us about This Place is for the Birds. You can sign up for those on the website, and there'll be links in the follow-up email. When we get going, please keep yourself on mute. If you have questions or comments, put them in the chat. Thank you. Tonight's speaker is Bridget Butler, also known as the Bird Diva, and she's been working in conservation and environmental education for more than 20 years throughout New England. She owns her own small business, Bird Diva Consulting, which provides presentations, outings, and online courses for folks interested in exploring the connection with birds. Her slow birding work has been featured in numerous podcasts, including American Birding Podcast. As a bird diva, she feels that birding is for anyone who enjoys and is curious about birds. If you take delight in noticing birds, you are a birder. She lives in St. Albans, Vermont, with her husband and 3 young children. Welcome, Bridget.
Dennis, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the introduction. It's so great to be here with you all tonight. It is a beautiful day here in northwestern Vermont, and I got a chance to get out and go for a walk before joining you all inside here. And I don't know, it's just really uplifting to hear all the bird song right now. I hope all of you are well and enjoying spring as it arrives. Can you tell me where you are perched right now? Put in the chat where you're joining us from. I'm just curious about where folks are kind of, yeah, where's your perch right now? Where are you hanging out? I'm also going to put something else in the chat. Let me see if I can do this really quick here. In tonight's talk, I'm going to mention a lot of different books. And I've learned after doing this a number of times that people want that book list. So I'm going to give it to you right away so you don't have to worry about writing books down or finding it. All right, super. Oh, look at all of this. Okay, lots of people from Connecticut. That makes tons of sense. We got West Virginia, New Jersey, all kinds of different places. Oh my gosh, there we go, in LA. All right, there we go. Oh, good. And some names I recognize too. This is wonderful. So great to have you all. All right, I am going to share my screen and we'll get underway tonight. And we need to move that out of the way so that you can actually see the slide. There we go. All right, give me 1 second while I rearrange things here so I can keep an eye on the chat, because I do encourage folks during the presentation, if you have questions, to go ahead and put them in there. And there's going to be a couple times when I'm actually going to ask you to participate, and I'm going to ask you a question and you're going to put something in the chat if you feel like it. So keep that open as we go. So the presentation that I have for you tonight is called The Lost Legacy of Women in Ornithology, Birding Herstory. So this presentation represents a multiple year journey for me, really through the development of my slow birding programs, which Dennis mentioned and some of you may have participated in. I've begun to tease apart really what I love about birding and what honestly doesn't work for me. And as I did that, I really started to ask questions about where are all the women in birding? And so looking at the actual history of birding and the women's stories that haven't been told, it's been really freeing and validating for me. And it's really helped me understand my own birding practice and why traditional birding or mainstream birding wasn't always satisfying for me. I really wanted to find others who birded like me. And I started to ask the question about where are all the female role models and why did I have so few of them? And why didn't I see women really strongly represented in the stories we told about the birding community? There's no way I can fit in everything that I learned over the time that I spent kind of researching this a little bit more. But I'm going to kind of distill it all and give it to you in the presentation tonight. So this is kind of a summary of what I discovered as I started researching the backstory of women in birding. So tonight what we'll talk about is we'll talk a little bit about the differences between birding and bird watching. We'll talk about gender and birding. There's actually some really fascinating research going on about that. We'll ask the question, where are the women? And we're going to find some of them. So I'm going to introduce to you some of the women who I think of as the mothers of ornithology. And we'll wrap up by talking about why does this even matter? Why should we be pulling some of these stories into the light again and discussing them more, and how some of these stories have actually influenced science today. Like I said, please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go, and I'll try to answer them. And at some point, I'm going to ask you to participate too. So the first place that I started was the difference between birding and bird watching, and thinking about how different people use each of those terms and where people feel like they belong. So this is the first question I'm going to ask you. When you talk about your connection to birds, do you call yourself a birder? Do you call yourself a bird watcher? Do you call yourself something else? So you can feel free to put that in the chat. So whether we like it or not, there are some stereotypes when it comes to birding. And on this slide, I kind of represent the two most distinct stereotypes that we kind of have. Awesome. Thank you for putting some answers in the chat. So we've got birder in here. Good, good, good. So the birder, right, we tend to think of that person as someone who may be a little bit more compulsive, list-driven, disproportionately male. That's that slide at the top. And sometimes when we think about stereotypes around calling people bird watchers, we think of one who enjoys birds in the yard or the gardens or the nearby park. This could be like the little old lady in the picture that feeds birds, right? And as Kim is pointing out in the chat too, right, there are some folks who are really trying to shift our thinking around calling bird watching, using the phrase bird watching, because it is not as inclusive as birder, right? Thinking that there are many people who are not sighted, who are blind, who enjoy birding just the same. And so there has been some reclaiming of the word birder. And I want to be really careful around that, because for some people, they want to be called the bird watcher because they want to be separate from birders, because the stereotype that they have in their mind for a birder is not a positive one. And so if we look back at how these terms really came to be, we kind of find a couple of things. In 1969, Birding magazine defined a birder as someone who seriously pursues the hobby of birding, professional or amateur. And then they went on to define a bird watcher as someone who birds, pardon me, let me get a sip of water here. A bird watcher watches birds for any reason at all, but should not be used to refer to a serious birder. We're going to come back to that serious thing because it comes up again in some of the science. Oh my, give me a second. There we go. So when we look back at how the terms have been used, we can find a bunch of different things. So we find this piece from Birding Magazine in 1969. We can go back even farther and we can find a reference to a word, birding, where we put before birding in Shakespeare's Merry Wives of Windsor to actually refer to hunting. But later it was put to use by one of the women we're going to talk about as a way to study birds. Birdwatching, that term was first used by British ornithologist Edmund Selous in 1901 in the title of one of his books on birds. And now the birding community, like Kim mentioned, is working to redefine the term birding, making it more accessible to a variety of birders and kind of breaking up that negative stereotype. This includes folks like Freya McGregor from Access Birding and the group Birdability. The point here is that we use all these different terms to kind of describe our identity as folks who like to connect with birds. And there have been times within our birding community where we have used these words in a way to kind of not include others, to be more exclusive. And what I'd like to do is really think about how we can break that apart and really kind of, like we're talking about, reclaim birding and recognize that there are many different ways to come into this connection with birds. There's been some fascinating work done on this, and this is really the human dimension to birding, which has just begun to be studied in the past 30 years or so. This is where we're looking at the social construction of birding and how the activity is influenced by culture and community. So it's actually something that we can study now. We use social sciences in order to study this. And there have been some fascinating papers in the past 15 years around how we think about different types or categories of birders. In 2010, there was a study in Ecology and Society by Karen Cooper and Jennifer Smith, and they studied differences in how men and women bird in the United States. And what they discovered in their work was that they came up with 4 different categories of birders, which you'll see on the slide here. Overall, they found that the more competitive the pursuit of birding, that practice, the more males and fewer females participated. So on the slide here, you'll see the top 2, supportive and participatory. So supportive activities involve slightly more women than men, and participatory activities had up to 70% women in them in comparison to men. So our supportive activities included things that tended to be non-competitive, basic things like membership in a bird organization or a club. Participatory activities also have little competition and involved a lot of the community science projects that we participate in now. Anything from the Christmas bird count to feeder watch, things of that nature. Now, the bottom 2 types of birders, number 3 and number 4, competitive birding was even more skewed than those first 2 categories, with 80 to 99% of the participants in the study were male. And then the 4th group is the authoritative group, which included members of regional records committees and had 72 to 93% male makeup. So both of these bottom 2 groups involved a more competitive pursuit. So sharing or ranking lists, entering a birding competition was the competitive group, and the authoritative group, leading trips, compiling bird counts, serving on records committees, tended to have more male makeup. They also noted that across many careers and hobbies that men prefer competition more than women and tend to be more confident at times. They found in this study that men often ranked their ability higher than it actually was, whereas women tended to show less confidence in their skills and their abilities. So this was really fascinating to kind of start to break down. What I think is really interesting as we move forward is we are beginning to recognize that gender is really fluid in a way. So when we start to think about whether or not birding is gendered, many of the studies that are out there right now, some going back maybe 20 years, are really thinking about that male female binary. And I really look forward to some of the research that's going to come that kind of looks at folks who identify themselves as non-binary and how that influences the way that we look at our birding community. So when I started to think about, is birding gendered? Am I birding differently because I'm female? I started to dig into a couple of other papers, including The Gendered Nature of Serious Birdwatching that came out in 2015, and Gender-Based Differences in Birdwatchers' Participation and Commitment. And what was really interesting here, we're going to go back to that word serious again. So in this context, serious is used as a measurement in this type of study, where serious, like leisure, would involve perseverance of being laid back, display of personal effort on knowledge and training, benefits and your identity wrapped into that as well. And so here they found in this research that both males and females show a high level of commitment to bird watching and seriousness, which is measured by perseverance, effort, identity, and social connection, and that both males and females benefit equally from this level of participation. However, what they found out when they dug a little bit deeper and asked some different questions, they discovered that men and women held different values around nature, that women showed a stronger moralistic value towards birds and nature, and men show stronger utilitarian values. So what does that mean? Moralistic values include an ethical concern for nature, that empathy towards really taking action. We could see that in the other study as well, right? So we saw that women tend to pursue community science projects more. So that connects directly to these moralistic values. And then utilitarian values are values where one benefits from the practical use and material exploitation of nature. And these values typologies come from Stephen Kellert, who did a lot of work on different types of typologies around values typologies around nature and wildlife and how we interact with them. In the paper that Moore did in 2008, they explained how socialization processes affect gender difference in their pursuit of birdwatching. They described listing as competitive and a competitive and masculine endeavor, likened to listing as a form of hunting, where the game is bagged, but in non-lethal ways. And in contrast, they noted that an ethic of care might both constrain and shape women's involvement in birdwatching. On the positive side, they thought that this value of care might inspire women to protect birds and lend support to conservation efforts. Now, of course, there's a lot of variability here, right? So we have female listers and we have male conservationists. In one of the papers, they recognized that studies should be mindful that there exists an intergroup diversity among both men and women. And ignoring such diversity potentially reinforces the stereotypes, right, that we've been talking about how men and women engage in wildlife-related recreational activities. But for me, this was really about trying to explore why I felt like I didn't belong to the broader birding community as it was. So I really didn't want to list anymore. I really wanted to sit and hang out and like be with birds for a longer amount of time. That's where my slow birding practice really took root. And so I wanted to find a different way to explain what I was experiencing. And one of the things that I came up with is I really didn't have a lot of role models. I wasn't seeing a lot of women represented in the birding community or in the books that I was being told I should read as I was learning about birds. So here's where you get to participate again. Think about those folks who have influenced the field of ornithology or even natural history. Who pops into your mind first? Who are some of the folks that pop into your mind first? Whose stories have really dominated history? Awesome, here we go. They're coming into the chat. This is just another way of looking at belonging in birding. Who are my role models? Who's being put in front of me as a role model. So who was put in front of you as a role model? And I'm not, I'm, you guys, okay, here we go. Right. We got Rachel Carson. We got Florence Miriam Bailey. All right. Roger Tory Peterson. Great. Rachel Carson and David Sibley. Pete Dunne. Great. Honestly, all the Roger Tory Peterson. See, and this is the thing, right? And I love this because what happens is sometimes we get stuck in an echo chamber, where like I repeat the same person to you and you report it to the repeat it, wow, to the next person, right? And we kind of have this really narrow view. And what I've been trying to do in my work is kind of widen that field of view and not repeat the same names all the time and look for those other people. So we have a lot of great contemporary women. We have Debbie Shearwater, we have Julie Zickfus here. Rachel Carson is the woman that comes up the most. I know why Brianna is talking about Florence Miriam Bailey, because Brianna and I have connected over this very topic. Yay, Barbara. All right, Mabel Osgood Wright. You've almost hit on all the women I'm going to talk about tonight, which is so very good. So this is the thing. We hear these same voices over and over again. We repeat those same voices. And one of the things I want to encourage you to do tonight is think about how do we bring more voices in? Because the more voices that we bring in, the more folks are going to feel like they belong. They will find somebody that they connect with. If they don't connect to Pete Dunne or they don't connect to Rachel Carson's story, the other women, Jane Goodall is another woman who comes up a lot when I do these presentations. If you don't connect to Jane, there are other women or other people who you can identify with, and we need to do a better job of kind of shining the light on those folks. So historically, where are all the women? This is the piece that I really started to dig into a little bit more, was there's got to be some women out there that go further back than Rachel Carson. Like, who was Rachel Carson influenced by? And then I go back again and find out who this next person was and just keep going back and back and back. And so the three things that I found over and over again is that women were barred from participation. When they did finally get a foot in the door and were able to participate, they were marginalized. And then maybe they were even overlooked, or their work was overlooked for a period of time, and we need to bring their work back into the conversation. So let's look at this just a little bit more. So we've been told that birding is a male dominated activity, but no, that's really not the case, right? If we look at the 2021 National Survey of Bird Watchers, that was done by Cornell, the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, and the National Flyway Council, we find that actually in that survey that 56% of women identified, 56% of folks who identified themselves as bird watchers were women. So it's really not as dominated by men as we think. I'm going to get back to that though, because the roles that we play within the community at times have been limited. I do think this is changing though. Here's another really interesting piece. When I look at the history of birding and I started to study collections of nature writing and folks who were writing about birds, I found that the representation was a little bit off. So 6-1, many collections of nature writing published up to the 1990s heavily featured male writers. Roger Tory Peterson's 1957 collection, The Birdwatchers Anthology, 3 out of the 80 writers in that book were women. Gina, you asked, is the survey US or global? So that was from the United States. Thanks for that question, for that clarification. That's really good. So Roger Tory Peterson's anthology, 3 out of 80 writers were women. And we can even fast forward to the 1990s for the Norton Book of Nature, which was pulled together by John Elder and Robert Finch. And we find that 15 out of 94 of the writers featured in that book were women. However, here's what's really kind of cool. When we look back at nature essays contributed to the Atlantic Monthly in the late 19th century. Like, go back. The women are there. This is what's great. 50% of the Nature essays contributed to the Atlantic Monthly were written by women. So here's what's really fascinating. Why is there this disconnect? Why are we not seeing more of this writing like pulled into present day anthologies? Um, there were a lot of interesting things that kind of influenced how women's work was put out there. One of them during the Victorian era were the separate spheres that of kind of roles for men and women. So many women during that time were barred from the first professional ornithological clubs. In fact, one of the first ornithological clubs in North America was one of the first groups that asked me to come and do this talk for them. And I believe the date was that they hadn't allowed women in their club until the 1970s. Totally fascinating. So we have women being barred from professional ornithological clubs. We have their work observing birds being diminished because it was often considered too sympathetic, or women were relegated to writing children's books. I still find this in my work today. Many folks, when I meet them and I talk about my work, they're like, "Oh, you should work with children." Like, that's the very first thing. I'm like, I do, but adults are just as important to be connecting with and working with. And both men and women can do that type of work. The other piece that's really important here is that during that Victorian era and kind of for, I don't know, maybe like the next 50 years or so, American culture was really inclined to conquest and mastery of nature. So that goes back to that male utilitarian value of nature. So women's writing was really overlooked. And so if it wasn't something that was big and adventurous and had conquest involved, even Thoreau's work, Walden, really demonstrated that being in nature was separate from our own everyday experience. And that's what's really interesting. The writing from women from this Victorian era was really about their everyday experience with birds. So we're going to fix this tonight. I'm going to introduce you to three women that I consider the mothers of ornithology. You guys have named two of them. I'm going to give you just a minute to see if you can name the third one, and you'll get all of them. So put in the box. I'll tell you, it's another woman from that Victorian era. So mothers of ornithology. We've got three of them. You got Florence, you've got Mabel, and there's a third one, and she's the spiciest one, I think, of all of them. All right, Gina, Anna Botsford Comstock. She's great too. It's not Anna. All right. Anybody else? Game? Well, good. At least maybe I'll introduce one new female ornithologist to you tonight. All right, Florence. Florence is probably the one that we've heard the most about. She was the first woman associate member of the American Ornithologists Union, the AOU, in 1885. She was the first woman elected as a fellow of the AOU in 1929, and she was the first woman recipient of the AOU's William Brewster Memorial Award in 1931. She was also a member of the Cooper Ornithological Club, the Wilson Ornithological Club, and the National Audubon Society. What I think is really amazing about Florence that I absolutely loved is that she is credited, and she should be credited, with the first modern field guide to birds for North America. She was really the first to use birding to refer to the act of studying birds. And she became one of the foremost activists for bird protection and founder of early Audubon societies. She advocated for studying live birds in the field rather than shooting them, much like the other two women that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So she has a fascinating history. There's a number of different books out there. You can see them all on that book list that I gave you, so don't panic. I'm going to show you some of these books, but they're all written down. And all three of these, I believe you can get, maybe not in these beautiful original covers, but in a new updated version. So these are three of the books that Florence published. Birds Through an Opera Glass in 1890 is the one that was published when she was 26. It's a collection of articles that she had written for Audubon magazine. They were illustrated by Luis Agassiz Fuertes, who some say is a better illustrator than Audubon. And what's magnificent about this book is that it combined the best scientific knowledge and the best field experience of the time. It is, I shouldn't say was, it is narrative prose of each bird in a sense, and included both behavior and nesting information. This book really made a point about asking folks not to collect eggs, not to collect egg nests, not to collect bird specimens, which really went against what many of the other scientists in the field of ornithology were doing at the time. Super book. I have a big, yeah, there's like a big, lovely copy of it that you can get now. And you can get it online. And it's just, anyways, it's super fun to read because you can get an idea and a sense of the bird through her eyes. Very detailed writing about what she noticed. The second one, there's a birding word again that we talked about before, but this is not Florence hunting birds. This is Florence detailing her birding adventures in Twin Oaks, California, which is north of Los Angeles, and her use of the sit spot method. So this is a big practice that I use when I teach slow birding. What I love about Florence is she would pack up for the day and she would take a stool and all of her notebooks and things, and she would strap a stool to the side of the saddle and ride out into the scrub oak and then sit. She actually had it was like she was visiting neighbors, and she would go not only a birding but a calling on all of her bird friends and sit for long periods of time and take notes. I really enjoyed this book, and it actually inspired me to try to go a birding on a Bronco. I have a friend who has horses. She's a birder as well. It's not easy to sit on a horse and look through binoculars. So I totally understand why she brought that stool to sit and observe the birds that she was most interested in. Third book is Birds of New Mexico. This was published in 1928, and this is the one that led to her winning the William Brewster Memorial Award. Brewster once compared her fieldwork and writing to that of Thoreau and John Burroughs. Although he did, at the same time, he put her in a separate category due to the fact that she observed birds rather than collecting them. And get this, I think this is pretty funny. He chided her interest in bird songs, saying that he doubted the study of them was worth anything worthwhile. Yeah, well, we know a lot more now about birdsong and how important they are. If you don't know who William Brewster is, he was the co-founder of the American Ornithological Union, along with Elliott Coues and Joe Allen. And he gets into it with some of these women. And I'll tell you a little more about one of the women that he got into it with later on. A quote, one of my favorite quotes from Florence. I love this one, and I've got my chipping sparrow buddies in the background, male and female. Florence, in A Birding on a Bronco, wrote, "The temptations that come to conscientious observers are common to humanity, and one of the subtlest is to undervalue what is at hand and overvalue the rare or distant. Unless a bird is peculiarly interesting, it requires a definite effort to sit down and study him in your own dooryard or where he is so common as to be an everyday matter." So really getting at the everyday birds and what we can learn from them. All right, there's Florence. We're going to move on to the second mother of ornithology, who's actually friends with Florence. This is Olive Thorne Miller. She was also known, she had a pen name too, as Harriet Mann Miller. She was born in New York. All three of these women are from the East. And what I love about Olive Thorne Miller, this is the woman that is that third woman out that we didn't guess. So you get to meet her tonight. What I love about Olive is she didn't come into the study of birds until she was in her 50s. And my slow birding practice really started to take off when I turned 50. I'm now 54. And it shows you that it's never too late to like really dig in and get into something. So she began writing bird articles about her observations for Bird Lore magazine, the Atlantic Monthly, and the Auk. She was very active in advocating for the end of the millinery trade of bird feathers. And she published a number of different books, 11 bird related books. And she was one of the first 3 women inducted into the AOU, permitted membership, we really should say. She's really known for her detailed observations and her meticulous research on birds. She wrote under the pseudonym Olive Thorne when writing to local papers on issues of the time, and later added Miller to her works. She began writing for children publishing books. She began writing for children, publishing 2 books, mostly stories about different animals. So Olive and Florence would hang out together. Olive was older than Florence, and they met up. There's another book, one of the books that she wrote, which I think we're going to talk about next. Bird Lover in the West. There are sections of it where she's talking about she and Florence going birding together. And they had a great time out in Ohio, I think it was, finding different types of birds together and kind of challenging each other on their observations and their methods for observing birds. She was also one of the women that really got into it with William Brewster. So if you think back at the time, this wasn't social media or text messages going back and forth, calling each other out. This was all through letters that went through magazines. And it's really fascinating because you can dig up some of these letters that were in the Auk and some of the other in bird lore as well, where they go back and forth challenging each other. So William Brewster publicly chided her for not publishing in scientific journals, which is kind of ironic because a lot of women weren't allowed at that time to publish in scientific journals because many of them were amateur ornithologists. They didn't have degrees behind their name because, well, they didn't have the same opportunities to go to college. So she explained her choice of literary rather than scientific methods of explaining her work. And she gives the key to her nature work as one of the underlying principles of everything that she did in terms of birding, that her great desire was really to bring into the lives of other people the delights to be found in nature. So her purpose wasn't that scientific notoriety or to be acknowledged by the scientific community, although she bit back at that an awful lot. She prioritized really bringing more people into the love of nature and connecting with nature, which I think is something that many Audubon chapters do for their communities. All right, let's take a look at some of Olive's books. And these, I think I was able to get all of these as well, reprinted too. So you will be able to find these. Birdways was published in 1885. This is fascinating. You're going to love this. So this is a collection of observations of birds from her bird room. So she had a specific room in the city that she was living in at the time. She brought 35 species of birds from bird stores because they used to sell wild birds in bird stores and pet shops. And you could buy all different kinds of birds. So she brought all these different species of birds home and let them fly about in a room in her house. And she made observations of them there. So really fascinating, fun book to read. The second one is A Bird Lover in the West. These are her trips to Colorado, Ohio, and Utah to bird. And she did take a trip with Florence that she writes about in this book. And then the third one is an example of one of the books that she wrote to begin with when she was starting out writing about birds, that was specifically published for kids and school teachers. It's an introduction to common birds, their anatomy, and a bit of how to attract and study them. The quote that I'm going to share with you is also from that letter where she clapped back in the awk at William Brewster for giving her a hard time for not publishing scientifically. She wrote, "To me, everything is a discovery. Each bird, on first sight, is a new creation. His manners and habits are a revelation as fresh and as interesting to me as though they had never been observed before." So this story about her and Brewster going back and forth is so significant that it was actually mentioned in her obituary, which was written by Florence Miriam Bailey, which appeared in the Auk after her passing. So really fascinating, fun to dig up and read through and learn more about these really amazing women. All right, number 3, the third mother of ornithology is the third woman to be accepted into the AOU. Her name is Mabel Osgood Wright. I love, love, love her writing. One of the books, I'll just tell you, you've got to read it. It's just amazing. So she was born in New York City. All 3 of these women lived fairly privileged lives, right? They were schooled at home or they went to private schools. They had choices when they left home. Well, some in terms of being married, some pursued the science to the best they could. I think Olive was the only one who had kids. I think both Florence and Mabel did not have children, probably to be able to pursue what they wanted to pursue in terms of studying birds. So she was a contributor, an editor for Bird Lore from its start in 1889 until her death. And she founded the oldest songbird sanctuary in the US and was a leader in the early Audubon movement. So she formed the Audubon Society of Connecticut with 12 other women in her community. And she was also a founding member of the board of the National Audubon Society in 1905. She really wanted to go to Cornell to study medicine, but she married instead. And she's considered by some to be the most influential woman in the Audubon movement of her time because of how she was able to kind of mobilize her community to create this first really beautiful Audubon sanctuary that is still active in Connecticut. All right. You'll probably guess the name of the Audubon sanctuary based on one of her books here. So when she began writing, this is fascinating. When she began writing, she wrote under a pseudonym to keep it secret from her husband. So she got busted because one of her husband's friends discovered the secret and went and told her husband that she was writing under a pseudonym. And what ended up happening is that this friend thought it was great. And he was like, she needs to publish her articles in a book form. And her husband thought it was great. And he reached out to one of his friends who was a publisher and got this first book published in 1894 called The Friendship of Nature. This book is incredible. It is a New England chronicle of birds and wildflowers. And so if you're from New England, I mean, many of you live in New England right now that are joining us tonight, it is incredible. And the articles that she wrote were articles for different magazines and papers that followed the phenology of the year. And so it's got this beautiful flow to it from season to season. Her work has been compared to Emerson in its prose, and even more importantly, for her power to see the miraculous in the common. This book went out of print for over 100 years and was just brought back by the Audubon Center, I believe in 94 or 95. There's a really beautiful new introduction to this book, one that really shouldn't be missed. The other piece that's interesting about this book is it came out the same year as John Muir's first book, The Mountains of California. So this is really a classic case of being overlooked due to the culture's focus on conquest and discovery of new and rare when it came to nature. Okay, it was 1999 when it was printed with a new introduction. And it's really a masterpiece of the practice of appreciating local, personal, familiar landscapes and wildlife close to home. The second book here is from 1895. So Birdcraft is the land, is the site, is the sanctuary that she built. And this one is a field book of 200 song, game, and water birds that she found at that site. Really beautiful book. I love all these covers. They're so cool. This last one is Citizen Bird. It has a much harder title. She wrote it with Elliot Coos, who's one of those co-founders of the at the AOU. And this is scenes from bird life in just really plain English for beginners. It really kind of, I think that pairing of Mabel and Elliot was great because she knew how to communicate with the layperson, with the everyday person. And she was really interested in drawing people in and connecting them with place. Really beautiful. All right, how about a quote from Mabel? Here we go. With my little ovenbird friend in the background. This is from The Friendship of Nature. She says, to claim the confidence of one feathered brother, to compass his ways and learn his secrets, to fathom his traits and philosophy, to gain recognition from him is a labor worthy of trial. So there are a number of things that I learned from these three women. And these were the things that I thought were core to leading to conservation. Each of these women brought so much to the table in terms of scientific knowledge. And it's something that I really think we can go back to and kind of lean on in our conservation work moving forward. So the first thing is to stay a while. Olive Thornmiller said, infinite patience, perseverance, untiring devotion, and more. A quick eye and ear and a sympathetic heart are important when connecting with birds. So this is really about patient immersion. All three of these women spent long hours observing birds, and this is at the core of slow birding and my practice that I love right now. And I have a couple of women to lean on for that. The second part is to keep a journal. And I know this can be really hard. And I think this is another thing that where sometimes we don't feel like we're good enough or we belong. We think we have to be a really great writer or a really amazing artist in order to have a field journal. But really, it's just about writing down what you notice. Florence Marion Bailey said, sympathetic, trustworthy observation and a record of the habits of the living bird is what is most needed now. And she said that back in the day, and I think that's still so very true. All three of these women were masters of noticing, not identifying, but of noticing fine details, which gained them respect in the ornithological community. And then the last one is ask and share. And I would add listen too here. They were all really good at making friends with the locals and asking them about their experiences and listening to them, listening to their colloquial names for birds, for their sightings of where they were seeing different birds. They were really good at knowing their audience and how to write for them to draw them in. They were master science communicators of the time, and I think can really serve as great examples and inspiration moving forward. So as we wrap up tonight, I want to talk a little bit about why this all matters. And I thought about this a lot, and I dug into it a little bit more to kind of put some backbone to it. And these are the three things that I came up with. So the first one is that we're really missing the bigger picture. When we lose stories, when we lose diverse stories of how people connect with nature and people connect with birds, we get stuck in stereotypes, like at the top of my presentation, right? The birder, the bird watcher, what am I going to call myself? How am I going to identify? I don't want to be, I don't want to be judged as a birder. We're really missing the opportunity to see the entirety of our human experience with birds when we don't step out and welcome all these stories in. The other piece is that it carries over into our research, and we really start to limit our ability to ask an infinite number of questions in order to explore the world of birds, because we're only looking at it through one lens. When we all get stuck in the echo chamber and we keep repeating the same thing, we do the same thing in our research. And I'm going to point that out to you a little bit more in just a minute. And then the other piece is that it really undermines conservation. So if we're limiting our ability to ask an infinite number of questions, we're not using the depth and variety of perspectives that a diverse set of leaders would bring to the issue of protecting birds and biodiversity. And I pulled two different scientific projects that really demonstrate this. These are two examples of why it really matters. So how many of us learned that it was only male birds that sang? We had a handful of birds that we learned where the females sang, but that beautiful song, the melodic piece, was always sung by males. And what we found is that there's actually more female birds than sing than we thought of before. Actually, 70% of the world's female birds actually have their own song or a song similar to the ones that males sing. We can see this in the work from Karen Odom. She's a PhD. She did some really deep research in 2014 that led to the Female Birdsong Project, where we're looking for folks to pay a little bit more attention about different female birds and their songs in order to capture and record them. And what's interesting about this is the breakthrough in female birdsong research came due to more females in the field of ornithology, as a recent study shows that women are more likely than men to be authors, and even more likely to be first authors, the lead authors on papers about birdsong. Therefore, it's largely women who have reshaped this important field of study. And that's because different people ask different questions. And so we need to open up to all these diverse perspectives in order to kind of make science a little richer, right? And a little bit, just, I don't know, a little more open to what's possible. So we find that with the female birdsong work that's happening right now. And then the other one that's from my home state, this is a female Bicknell's thrush that's on the nest here. One of the other important things in terms of conservation is that oftentimes we focus on the male bird. And so scientists are actually recognizing the need to learn more about the differences in how male and female birds use wintering grounds, use different habitat types within their breeding grounds, use different habitats when they're migrating, all of that. The work that the Vermont Center for Eco Studies has done in Hispaniola about Bicknell's thrush, they found that females tend to inhabit mid-elevation forests that are more vulnerable to human disturbance than the higher elevation, more remote, relatively pristine forests that are used by males. And so the important thing here is if we don't know that, if we don't know how males and females are segregating, we can't do the on-the-ground work that we need to do in order to conserve both those different types of habitats for birds. So really fascinating moving forward where we can go as we find more women in the field of science and ornithology. So here are my recommendations for all of us in our conservation work. We can go back in order to go forward, really looking back in history for women, and BIPOC folks who are studying and writing about birds and natural history. We should tell those stories because someone out there is going to connect with those stories in a way that they haven't connected with all the other stories that we have shared before. So looking back in order to go forward can be really helpful. We can recognize that there are many ways to bird and be a birder. So this goes back to those, like, what do you call yourself? How do you identify as a birder? And really look at how you can make birding more accessible by breaking up some of those stereotypes and really asking what will make people feel like they belong. The third one is to learn female birds Make it a goal to pay attention and seek out female birds. Learn them by sight, learn them by sound, investigate their vocalizations. I think this is going to be my 5th year trying to document a female American redstart singing. Each time I've found a potential bird that I think is a female, it turns out to be an immature male. So I will keep trying this year. That's the one that I've kind of hung my hat on that I really enjoy trying to get a recording of to add to the Female Birdsong Project. So I encourage you to look at that a little bit more as well. And the last one is power, is shifting where the dynamics are for people in places of power. Seek out and ask for more women and BIPOC bird guides, speakers, trip leaders, committee board members. Remember that piece that I said where the research had found that men tend to overestimate their skills and women tend to undervalue their skills? I did that for a really long time. And a few years ago, I stopped doing that and I started to ask for places on committees, on boards, all of that. If I wasn't going to get the invitation, I was going to invite myself to the table. And so I encourage you to diversify your leadership, and I encourage you to speak up and share your skills if you are a woman or a person of color. All right. I told you I sent you a reading list, so you don't have to write all these down, but here are some of the books that I really dug into when I started looking into this edge for me and trying to understand what it was about how I identified as a birder and how it connected to my gender. So Birdwatching with American Women is a wonderful anthology about all kinds of women who contributed to the field of ornithology, including Florence, Mabel, and Olive. At Home on This Earth, 2 centuries of US women's nature writing. For all those women that were left out of some of those other anthologies, they have their own. No Woman Tenderfoot is a great biography about Florence Marion Bailey, including the pattern for the Victorian skirt that she had made special so she could ride astride her horse instead of side saddle on her horse when she was out west in Twin Oaks, birding on her Bronco. Woman Watching is a new one. This is about Louise de Kirolyn Lawrence and the Songbirds of Pimisi Bay. Marilyn Simmons wrote this book. She's a great speaker too. So if you're looking for another speaker, she is really wonderful. And the book's very, very good. All kinds of twists and turns with that. And if we look at for BIPOC herstory, these are some that I leaned on. Black Faces and White Spaces by Carolyn Finney. Trace by Laurette Savoy, and Dawnland Voices, which is a really incredible anthology of Indigenous writing from New England. So this is really all about reimagining our connection with birds and bringing some more stories in and being more inclusive. Birding really is for everyone, and I truly think that kind of going back to go forward is one of the ways that we can gain a little bit of inspiration and bring some new stories into our community. I want to thank you all for joining me tonight, and I'm going to welcome any questions that you may have. These are some of the ways that you can get in touch with me if you want to. Feel free to put things in the chat
Or
or
raise your
yeah.
hand and call on you, and you can unmute yourself.
Bridget, I still remember that field trip you gave us in State Place up in New York.
Up in New York, right?
Yeah,
It was
that's
all,
correct.
it's inspired by these women. I think it really, when I found these women, I started reading about them. It really allowed me to settle into my slow birding practice and have a lot of confidence that there would be other people out there who would enjoy birding in that way. I'm glad you remember it, Carl. It was very memorable for me too.
Well, that's my technique now also. So between birding or bird watching and my age, about
Right. And that's the other thing that we have to be okay about shifting, right? Is we can't bird the way that we did when we were 20. And that doesn't mean we have to stop birding, right? And we can do that as Audubon chapters, as well as provide opportunities for people to bird in different ways so they don't feel like they're going to be left out or they can't bird anymore. Donna, please visit my website at birddiva.com if you want to learn more about slow birding. And reach out. I'd be happy to share more.
One of the things I noticed with some of the quotes that you provided was that they talked about the birds as he.
Yeah.
And I've noticed in looking at some old field guides that there's a lot of that in the field guides.
Mm.
The they're talking about some bird, he will do this, he will do that with their habits. I wonder what that has to do with.
Yeah. You know what? I love that you brought that up. Thank you, because that is something that I've noticed too. I think the time period, right? Like, if you were to publish a book and if you changed all those pronouns out to she, the editor might say something, right? That's not the lens that we tend to look through first, and I even find I do that when I am noticing birds and there isn't that difference between male and female plumage, right? There's no difference between how they look. And I will call it a he. And so I'm purposely now trying every once in a while to say she, or sometimes I'll say they. And that can throw people because you're like, well, there aren't multiple chickadees out there. It's just one. And I'm like, well, I don't know if it's a he or a she. So I'm going to say they. And the reason why I don't use it is because it feels icky. And I don't feel like they're its. And Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about this, about needing how in other languages and other indigenous languages, especially, there are pronouns that aren't it, but they aren't male and they aren't female, right? So they recognize that non-binary place. And so I love playing around with this and using that when I'm leading bird outings and saying they instead. So it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun just to play around with that and think about it, and it makes you think about it in a broader context in relation to humans as well, I think. Kim says, I was born in 1962 and was taught to use he when writing if gender was unknown, so didn't find this odd. Yes, thank you, Kim, right? So we default to he. Fascinating. Super.
Any other questions, Hook?
Ooh, Gina's got a question.
You're not coming through, Gina.
Gina, sadly, you sound all pixelated, like you're calling from overseas. I don't know if you have a moment and can type your question or comment in the chat. That would be great as well.
Daily. Oh, that's weird. How about
Oh, no, you're back.
That's good.
I got you.
Okay, I put my hand down. I don't know if that made a difference. I was just thinking that maybe there's a continuum of birding. I'm kind of a slow birder now, even though I lead birding tours, and so sometimes that birding is faster. But it seems to me, I don't know if it comes with age or just experience with birding, but that when you start out, you want to see everything and you want to know everything and you want to build your list. And then I don't know what the change is, and maybe you've thought about this too. You want to slow down and get to know the birds more and not know how to identify, but just know their behavior. And I think that has been sort of my journey a bit. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I've experienced that too, definitely. Like I came through the conservation field working for different Audubon, state Audubon programs throughout New England and so my birding was through that conservation lens, that conservation intention, right? Like that was my purpose for birding, as well as connecting other people to birds. I'm definitely older now. And so behavior is definitely more interesting. Uh, and at the same time, what I've discovered in leading courses and outings that are slow birding focused is that there's a whole group of people out there that don't connect with the conservation data taking lens or even the listing part, right? Even when listing isn't competitive, that listing piece or that need to go out and get a bird, I got this bird, right? It doesn't appeal to them. And so I think that's another thing to keep in mind is that there may be this continuum that happens based on our experience and how we gain experience and kind of shift through our birding practice. But there's also people out there that are keeping themselves from connecting with birds and with the community because they don't see themselves in what's represented there right now. And so I think what's happened with slow birding is it allows people another entry point, which is really lovely and important. Kim asked, do my kids bird with me? So my kids are soon to be 11, 12, and 13 this month. Um, they don't bird with me, but they are very aware of birds and they bring me their bird stories all the time or what they're noticing. So by default, they're keyed into it. There are times when they want to go out with me. So like for some of the fun things like the woodcock, I used to do woodcock surveys or woodcock programs. They're really interested. If I'm going to go out and look for owls. And again, that's data driven. That's like a conservation intention. They want to go and do that sort of thing. But they're also very attuned and aware to the birds in the neighborhood and what they're noticing and when shifts come in without me having to say we're going to go out birding. So it's kind of just a part of their general awareness, I think.
Anyone else? Bridget, thank you so much.
Dennis, thanks
Truly
again. Thank you
fascinating.
all. It's so great to stay in touch with you. And I'm always creating new programs too. So if you need a speaker again in the future, I would love to come back and hang out with you all.
We'll pursue it. Thank you.
Thanks
Send
again.
us a list, Bridget.
All
Send us
right.
And next week, join us for Corey's program on salt marsh restoration.